Hi, everyone, and welcome to Navigating OCD. You'll see we've got a bit of a different setup today. I have got my first guest. It's
Ah,
Rebecca, hi, from Perinatal Stories Australia. You may already follow her on Instagram or listen to her podcast. I know I first came across you when I set up my OCD page. And I feel like we've always kind of rooted for each other a little bit from afar. Like I've always seen your posts and shared them and things like that. And I thought you'd be a great person to have on as my first guest.
oh,
So yeah, I just wondered if you'd be happy to share a bit of your story today. I thought maybe we could start obviously from your name, Perinatal Stories OCD, I know a lot of your mental health struggles and perinatal OCD came around your pregnancy and birth and after.
yeah,
But maybe we could start a little bit about your background and maybe what your mental health was like before this point, if you're happy to talk
definitely.
about
Of course. And firstly, I just wanted to say thank you so much for having me on
that.
here.
Oh, okay.
But also, yeah, definitely, it's been nice to see your journey from where you started your Instagram page to where you are now, setting up your podcast. So good on you.
Oh,
Um,
thank you. That's so kind.
and yeah, obviously, thank you for talking about OCD. It's a topic
Mhm.
very close to my heart.
Yeah, same.
Um, And I guess on that note, I have had OCD my whole life.
Mhm.
I just didn't know it. And I think, like for many of us, it's not until we enter motherhood that we find out that we have OCD. I guess I can't speak for everyone, but I know it tends to be brushed aside as anxiety.
Mhm.
That's not to say I didn't have anxiety because I
Yeah, yeah,
definitely
yeah.
did. I had a lot of anxiety growing up,
Mhm.
and that's what I was diagnosed as a teenager, and that's what I've carried for most of my life throughout my teens, my 20s. Um, in hindsight, though, looking back with my psychologist and psychiatrist and whatnot, we realized that there was OCD there as well.
Yeah.
But I guess because it was mild, moderate maybe, it just it never really raised any red flags
Mhm.
until I entered pregnancy and postpartum, and
Yeah.
that's when the symptoms became acute, and that's when it was, really obvious for a lot of
Yeah.
people that, hey, this is what's going on.
Yeah, I think that's so common for a lot of people as well. I know I was very similar, not in the sense that I haven't had children yet, but
Yeah.
when I look back, I can see that I have had OCD my whole life. Once again, I
Mm,
was a very anxious person. I would worry a lot, but you kind
mm,
of brush it under the carpet and get on with it. And I can
mm.
kind of see points in my life where I would have a few months at a time that it might be more severe, but I just kind of
Definitely.
pushed through it, got through it. And it wasn't until it became chronic and debilitating that you
Mm,
actually start looking into it and thinking, wow, okay, this is what I've actually got. So I think I
yeah,
can relate to you a lot there.
definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when did yours really take it up a notch? Was it during pregnancy or was it after you'd given birth?
Mm. That's a good question. I think it was escalating quite severely in pregnancy, but
Mhm.
again, it was just, oh, I've got high anxiety.
Yeah.
It wasn't until postpartum that I think because the symptoms became a lot more physical, it wasn't all just mental at that point,
Yeah.
that it became, what's going on here. But I think during pregnancy in particular, and I guess I want to just throw
Yeah.
it out there as well. Um, I didn't just have, I guess, anxiety or OCD. I also developed a phobia, which
Mhm.
unfortunately was a phobia of childbirth.
Yeah.
So I just want to put it out there that I guess when I'm talking about my symptoms, we're
Mhm.
still trying to piece together what exactly was the anxiety, what was the OCD, what was the
Yeah.
tochophobia, what was coming first, what was fueling, what's the chicken
It
or
can
the
all
egg? And I don't
overlap.
know, yeah, and I guess I don't have the answers there, but I'll try to explain as best I can.
Yeah, of course.
Definitely, it started with anxiety, but then I guess that was escalating in the sense that being pregnant, it was all I'd wanted. I always wanted to be a mum. Didn't know what career I would wanted or um, any other life plans, but I knew I wanted to be a mother. I wanted that, I guess relationship with my own children, and so being pregnant was the happiest I'd ever felt in my life, but it was also my most anxious.
Yeah.
Because I'd wanted it so much. And I guess that's where OCD latches onto your values, right?
Yeah. It's so important to you, and it knows it can get in there.
It's going to get in there and make you doubt everything and question yourself. And so, yeah, I spent a lot of the pregnancy thinking, I want to get this right. I'm going to use that in inverted commas. I want to get this parenting thing right.
Yeah.
And so even something as innocent as nappy rash cream, I became quite obsessive about and scared that I was going to make a wrong decision, that there was a wrong decision somehow, and that it was going to completely negatively ruin my child. So, I would spend hours upon hours every night and every day researching and trying to find the right answers. So I'll give you an example.
I was going to say like how we can differentiate that, because some people might be listening and be like, oh, well, all mums kind of worry and will want to get that right. But there is a big differentiation between that and OCD. Sorry if you want to continue.
No, you're so fine. So like a baby monitor, like the camera, I'd read a review and it was like, oh, I thank God I had this baby monitor because it picked up my child's breathing and then they stopped breathing and I was able to call an ambulance or something. But I really latched onto that. And for months, I was obsessively worrying, what if we get the wrong baby monitor and it doesn't save my child, kind of thing. So it was things like that. And I would just be researching, sending my husband options and, getting to the point of that decision paralysis where it was, I can't decide because if I make a decision and it's the wrong decision, I won't forgive myself, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that just escalated and escalated. I was anxious about birth, but I was also quite at peace with it. There were things that I was preparing for. And I guess that's the other side of it, is that I was over preparing for birth and postpartum because I thought, I've got a history of anxiety. Let's be proactive. I know I'm at risk for postpartum depression. But then that itself became quite obsessive.
Yeah.
And things, I think, escalated. I was at a parenting class and they decided to talk about postpartum depression and anxiety, which I'm really glad that they did. They brought up a foundation that we have here in Australia, and I was the only one in the room that knew about the foundation. I was seeing a perinatal psychologist through that foundation. But then they told the story about how that foundation came to life in this parenting class. And I think I knew the story, but it wasn't until this point in time that I'm going to say latched. I really latched onto it. And they used the words, this mum walked out the door and didn't come back. And I can't logically explain how I felt about that. But that to me is my tipping point. And, you and I think have spoken or commented on posts about harm OCD and suicide OCD.
Yeah.
And that's where that really kicked off for me, because in my head, oh, that's going to happen to me now.
Yeah.
And I became so obsessive about not wanting to walk out the door. I'm going to use that euphemism. That like even when I gave birth, I'll talk about the lead up, but after I gave birth and I couldn't sleep and I was very distressed, the hospital social worker came to see me, and all I could say to her while I was sobbing is, I don't want to walk out the door. I don't want to walk out the door. And she had no idea what I was trying to say, but I knew what I meant. It was like, I don't want it to get to that point. I was so scared about that.
Yeah.
So from that point in that parenting class is when I was convinced, okay, if I get postpartum depression and anxiety, I'm going to walk out the door. Like that was the illogical steps in my head. And so I had to then make plans and lists and all these things to prevent that from happening. So I was having lists all on my phone, just constantly writing lists. If I eat breakfast in the morning, if I have a shower, all the steps that people say, oh, here's how you can help your mental health. In my head, if I exercised, if I did all these things. So I had all these lists and I was like, well, I need to do them in postpartum. And if I'm rigid about it, I won't get it became very, very rigid and very,
very
very,
compulsive.
very.
Yeah.
And then that, I guess, fueled that's where the birth phobia kicked in. Or I don't know. Again, I don't know what started what or what fueled what,
It can
but
be very messy mental health. It'll
it was
all just
very
overlap.
messy.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I became scared of birth because I was convinced if birth doesn't go my way, or if birth doesn't go well, then I could get birth trauma, which could then lead to postpartum depression, anxiety, which could then lead to postpartum psychosis, which could then lead to me walking out the door.
Yeah.
Like I had this very black and white view of what was going to happen.
Yeah.
And I became scared of birth because it was something that I couldn't control. It's like no matter how many hypnobirthing classes you do or, books you read or whatever, there wasn't that control. And that's, as we know, can really fuel OCD, that feeling of uncertainty and lack of control. So, like I said, it changed from things like baby monitors to being completely fixated on birth and being fixated on something like postpartum psychosis. I read about it in one of the parenting books I'd read. It was such a small paragraph, but I was like, oh my God, this could happen to me. I could go crazy. I could hurt myself. I could hurt my kid.
Yeah.
And I became petrified, of what if I go crazy? What if I lose myself? What if I lose control? So yeah, that last, I guess, 2 or 3 months of my pregnancy was just consumed by this fear of walking out the door, losing control, not being in control, going crazy, hurting myself, hurting my kid.
Yeah.
I would pack and unpack my hospital bag over and over and over again because I was just convinced that there was a wrong way and I needed to get it right somehow. It was the only thing I could control.
Yeah.
And again, it's hard to know where's the tocophobia, where's the OCD, it's just all these things. I wasn't sleeping well. Again, just all those lists, and I kept having these horrible intrusive thoughts. Like if I went out to the shops that, I would see someone stabbing my belly or something, and I just became so scared to leave the house. And so I stayed inside, and it coincided with when we were having like the lockdowns for COVID, right? So it became a very convenient excuse. Oh, it's COVID, I can't go outside.
Yeah.
But it was really, oh, good, I don't have to make excuses anymore to cancel my plans with friends or, I'd had all these hopes and dreams for my last couple of weeks of pregnancy that I'd go see my friends, go get a massage, go, on a little weekend girls trip or something. None of it. None of it.
And those hopes and dreams, OCD will love it because it knows that that's what you want. That's what you've kind of envisaged.
Yeah.
And it just gives it that extra fuel, doesn't it?
Absolutely. So none of that happened.
Yeah.
On one hand because of COVID, but
yeah. And how had you vocalized how you were feeling? Had your partner picked up anything or your family?
Yeah, I guess it was, oh, Beck's anxious, right? Oh, it's the hormones, it's anxiety. And we knew I had anxiety. I was seeing a perinatal psychologist. I was seeing an obstetric social worker through the hospital. Everyone knew I was anxious, but it was, oh, it's my anxiety.
Yeah.
And that was just what it was. And it's a hard one to sit with because I've had anxiety my whole life, and I'd gone into pregnancy saying, I've done therapy for so long. I'm so proud of where I'm at. I'm doing really well. I don't want anxiety to get in the way of pregnancy, birth, postpartum. I didn't want it to get in the way of my parenting. So I was feeling quite proud of myself for how well I'd been managing. But I guess, looking back in hindsight, which was a real slap in the face, I realized that I wasn't managing, I was just controlling.
Yeah, I was going to say that sounds almost compulsive for the OCD, because you're almost trying to control the situation. And for OCD, once again, it's just going to add that fuel to the fire.
Absolutely. So it was all my anxieties just feeling a bit out of control. And I just had this thing in my head as well, even though I was so scared, and I was speaking to the psychologist, I was speaking to the obstetric social worker, my obstetrician knew what was going on. I think because my anxiety, how do I put this? My threshold's quite high, right?
Yeah.
So it was like, oh, this is moderate for me, when really it was high.
Yeah.
But I just kept
You're so used to it.
I'm so used to it. And it wasn't the anxiety that I used to have as a kid, where it was panic attack after panic attack, social anxiety. It wasn't like that. And so because it wasn't so obvious to me, I think I downplayed, oh, I'm anxious. But once birth is over, once that thing I'm scared of is over, I'll be okay.
Yeah.
Is what I kept telling myself, what I kept telling a lot of people. I guess that's what I really hoped for as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, that didn't happen. Yeah, that's the story of my pregnancy.
Yeah.
And then birth happened.
I was going to say, how did it progress when you got to the birth?
Not well, because, you know, my beautiful obstetrician knew how anxious I was. And one day she came to me and said, look, Beck, some of my anxious clients tend to opt for a C-section because it gives them more control. You know, there's these steps that happens, it's this amount of time and it's done. I think you can have a very safe and healthy vaginal birth, but I just want to present you with this option. And I'm glad she did that. I'm very grateful that it wasn't, oh, you're anxious, no, you can't have a C-section. But in saying that, that was also another decision that I crumbled, absolutely crumbled. Every day, all I could think about was birth. I'd be in the office at work before I went on leave and I'd just burst into tears if I thought about birth, or I was just constantly researching, what about this option? What about that option? What if this happens? What are the side effects? What are the consequences? And it just, again, that was another point of decision paralysis. But again, I don't know where, again, OCD or the tocophobia, you know, where it's crossing over, but I couldn't move. There were times where I'd be on the shower floor crying for an hour and I'd just be so scared to move because moving felt like I'd have to accept that time was going forward. This birth is coming. I have to go through it. And there were times where I had moments and I tried to suppress those thoughts, but the thought of dying was nicer to me than going through birth. But I opted for the C-section in the end, but I didn't really commit to that decision because, again, it felt like, oh, if I make a decision and it's the wrong decision. So even the morning of my C-section, I was like, oh, what if I go into labor naturally? Maybe I'll change my mind, blah, blah, blah. So it was all, I guess my heart wasn't in that decision, but it was the decision I made. I sobbed through the hallways of the hospital to the C-section. It was a textbook C-section. Everything was fine. My son was very healthy. He was born. But I was so scared. I kept having panic attack after panic attack on the table. And I didn't want to hold my son when he was born. You know, they offer you the baby. And I was like, I was just so anxious that I couldn't even think about him. And that still eats at me because, you know, you don't ever want your anxiety or your mental health to get in the way of, you know, your bond or your love with your children. And my first role as his mum, to hold him, I couldn't even do that because I just wanted to know that the surgery would be over soon. That's all I could think about. Eventually did get to
I was going to say, it shows just how debilitating OCD and mental health can be, doesn't it? That you feel like you can't hold your child after they're born. And for people that are listening, that I know a lot of people listen that have got family members and so haven't experienced it themselves but have got family members going through it. I think that really is a good example to show just how tough it can be.
And, you know, obviously the shame and guilt that I felt fuels, I guess, what happened postpartum as well. But then another thing, I guess, added to my mental health, which was I developed really acute PTSD within 2 days of birth. And that, I think, comes from the phobia of having to go through birth, not having processed that. I guess unlike most phobias, you know, hypothetically, if you're petrified of dogs, there's no timeline, right? You don't have to overcome that phobia. You don't have to get flooded by emotions. Whereas with birth, you know, the baby's inside of you. There is a timeline. It is going to come out. You are going to be confronted with that. Your worst fear. It's going to happen. yeah, whether you're ready or not. And so you are flooded by those emotions, as my psychologist explained to me. So yeah, I ended up with, hypervigilance and insomnia, very, very acute distress within 2 days of birth. I just kept having flashbacks of what was happening. And because of that, I think is where the OCD just absolutely spiraled from there. Just that rapid onset just escalated. So again, it was that harm OCD, that suicide OCD. I don't want to walk out the door. I'm not sleeping. Oh my God, this means I'm going to get psychosis. This means I'm going to hurt my son. And that's all I could think about all day, every day. I obviously couldn't sleep. And I just had these horrible, horrible, intrusive thoughts of hurting my son somehow. And, then I guess that's where the behaviors come in. I stopped breastfeeding him because I was in a lot of pain and I wasn't sleeping, but also because there was that part of me that thought, if something happens to me, if I get psychosis, if I die, if I hurt myself, at least he'll be okay because he won't have been relying on me. So I was trying to put in those protective behaviors for him. I would, like, my mum had moved in for a couple of weeks when we had my son. And in that first week, she or my husband would leave scissors on the kitchen counter. I would just be shaking and I'd have to hide them. I'd have to quickly put them in the drawer, shut the drawer, and try to forget that was where they lived. In my head, I was like, I have to forget, because if I go crazy, I need to not know where they are just in case. My husband used to be a cook or a chef, and he has, all his fancy frickin' knives in the kitchen on display. Yeah. So I would have to walk into the kitchen, but with my back towards the knives, so I couldn't see them, because what if I go crazy? What if I know where they are? I need to not look at them because I can't trust myself.
And how were your partner and your mom during this time? So obviously they were watching you in this week after birth.
Yeah.
Did they see to the extent that you was experiencing it, or was you kind of keeping some a bit inside?
Oh, I think because at this point it was very physically obvious. It's not just, I'm researching or I'm thinking things through. I'm constantly in tears. I'm unable to sleep. I'm fixating on I'm never going to be able to sleep again, or what kind of mother am I that I'm having these thoughts about my son? What does this say about me? OCD is very good at attaching meaning to our thoughts, right? So, yeah, there was no hiding it, really. My husband's one of those people who's like, oh, she'll be right. He's almost in denial, but it was getting to the point where he was like, oh,
there's something
what's going on? Yeah. I also would make my husband hold me for hours, restrain me, because I just thought, if I'm not restrained, what if I go crazy and I'm capable of doing something to myself or my son?
And that's such a common OCD theme as well. The fear of going crazy, isn't it? And the fear of losing control is just, it's common through so many OCD themes.
Yeah, definitely. It's that, oh, what if I get postpartum psychosis? And that to me was awful. And then there was the harm OCD, the suicide OCD. There was just all these things converging. I'd had a psychiatrist come consult at the hospital just before I was discharged, so maybe day 4 or something. And she'd given me a TCA, so the old type of antidepressant, so a tricyclic antidepressant. And all of a sudden my mood dropped. This was the first time I'd ever taken medication in my life. And it absolutely plummeted. And so there was that part of me that's like, is it the antidepressant causing me to have these thoughts? Is it that causing me, all these things? And so I went to the GP. It made my husband drive me. I couldn't drive. I'd just been cut open. Made my husband drive me. And I'd said to the GP, I don't know what's going on. I don't know if it's the medication. I don't know what's happening here. But I keep having these thoughts. I don't want to act on them. I'd said that. I don't want to act on them. I kept saying that to my husband. I don't want to hurt myself, but that's all I keep seeing. And this GP had said to me, oh, well, you're obviously suicidal. The medication's making you suicidal. You need to go to the psych hospital, in emergency. Your husband needs to drive you to emergency. And not knowing, that the difference between intrusive thoughts or
Yeah.
actual suicidality or whatnot.
Yeah. Yeah, because it can seem just so, if someone's not knowledgeable on OCD, you would think it was real.
Yeah.
My suicide OCD, even obviously looking back now, I'm able to kind of see the difference, but it just feels,
it does.
It feels the same.
Because you think, oh, I'm thinking it, so therefore I must be feeling it, or I want to act on it
Yeah.
because
And
I'm thinking it and I can't stop thinking about it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
100%. So then, you went to the psych hospital from there.
No.
Okay.
My husband was like, this GP, I'm not taking it. Because me being me, I'm the good girl. I'm like, oh, but the doctor said I have to go. So I have to. My husband's like, no, we're not going. I'm not driving you to the psych hospital. The point of going to the emergency was to wash out the antidepressants. I'd only been on them for less than 4 days, but the GP had said, you are at such a high dose. This psychiatrist had given you such a high dose. We need to be really careful. You need to wash out, blah, blah, blah.
Okay.
My husband's like, no, I'd rather you safe at home. I can keep an eye on you. If things escalate, I will take you to blah, blah, blah. My husband was very, I'm not driving to emergency.
Yeah.
Which I am in hindsight grateful about. At the time I was like, but no, I'm going to get in trouble.
Yeah. And I think that's such a personality trait of people with OCD, like wanting to do the right thing, and be the good girl. Like, in hindsight, I've always been like that. And when I speak to people, they're all very similar. So it's funny that you say that.
It's funny in hindsight. At the time I was like, I can't believe it. I think this guy thinks I'm gonna hurt myself. Maybe I do. Like, it just adds to the rhetoric and the conversation that you're having with yourself, right? So I went cold turkey off the medication, which was like the most naughtiest thing I've ever done in my life, was not do what I'm told.
Yeah.
But I was fine in that sense. I didn't have any reaction. Don't recommend it, obviously, to anyone listening. Like, do what you're told. But so that low mood lifted, but the OCD, the anxiety, the PTSD, that was all still there, and I couldn't ignore that.
Yeah.
So I think it got to the point after making my husband hold me for days, hours on end for a couple of days in a row, that he was like, he looked at me and he said, Beck, I think I need to take you to emergency. And so for him to say that, for my husband who's, I'm not going to, you don't need to go to the doctor. My arm's broken. It's fine. Like, for him to be like that, to say, I think I need to take you to emergency, was my wake up call.
Yeah.
It was like, I can't get better with just therapy. I might need medication. I might need more intensive help, but it's not going to get better as it is. I need far more help. And that's when we called the social worker from the hospital. And, we said, I need to go to a mother and baby psychiatric hospital. I'd never heard of one before, but she happened to bring it up in the hospital, at the maternity hospital, just before I was discharged. And at the time, that just fueled everything, because it was like, oh my God, she thinks I'm crazy.
Yeah.
Oh my God, there's something wrong with me. What does this say about me? All these things. And she got me in within 2 days, which I'm very, very grateful for. At the time, it was the only one in our state. There was only one, and it was private. And I was very, very fortunate to have private health insurance. Those 2 days felt like years. I genuinely did not know that I was going to make it to those 2 days. Again, not because I wanted to do anything, but I turned to my husband and said, I don't want to be here anymore. Like, I don't want to do anything about that thought, but that's just how I feel.
Yeah. I can relate to that, because it's like, it's not that you want to do that. It's that you can't live with the pain anymore. And I used to think, like, and it's so crazy to say to people, but like, I didn't know how I'd make it to the end of every day. And it's like, it's not that I thought I was going to do anything. I just couldn't physically live with that pain.
I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. No. I was so distressed. All I could think was, my son deserves better than me. I'm going to ruin this kid. And that whole, do I even love? And it's so silly. It's like, do I love him? Of course I loved him, but I needed to know the answer. I needed that black and white. And so that was all I could think about all day, every day. Oh, do I even love him? How much do I love him? If I loved him, I wouldn't be having these thoughts, and
Mhm.
blah, he deserves better than me. And that was just constantly on repeat. And it was like, I can't do this anymore. I
Yeah.
can't be here anymore. And there was a lot of shame going into a psychiatric hospital. I wanted help, but I also thought, I'm beyond any help. There's no
Yeah.
way they can fix me. I'm gone. They're gonna,
Mhm.
get to the end of however many weeks I need to be there and say, you're broken. We're taking your son away from you.
Mhm.
Blah blah blah.
Yeah, because
So
I suppose that's a really big additional fear as well there.
yeah,
Yeah. So what?
having your
Go
yeah
on, sorry.
no, having your kids taken away, I think, is a really big barrier for a lot of women, and not just OCD, but
Yeah.
depression, anxiety,
Mhm.
um, any of that in the postpartum period. It's hard enough having that layer of mental health, but to have the added layer of I can't talk about it
Mm.
because what if they take my kids away, I think is a really big barrier for people to
Yeah.
have to ask for help or to accept that help.
Mhm.
But that decision was like going to that mother baby unit, the MBU, was the best thing that I could have ever done in my life. It saved my life. They were so compassionate and kind, and just, yeah, I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for them. They put me on the right medication. They put me on an SSRI. Sorry. Yeah. Zoloft. Sorry, sertraline.
No. Yeah.
I lost my mind, my train of thought. Yeah, they put me on sertraline. There was group therapy, so we'd go and we'd talk about things, or just learn things. I think that psychoeducation was really helpful. And one day, they okay. Before I get to this point, when they put me on the sertraline, it was like they were like, you'll actually start to be able to make more sense of your thoughts. It'll actually help you. Because I remember saying, I don't want to lose my thoughts. I don't know why I
Yeah.
was holding on to, I need my thoughts. These are who I am. I think about things.
Yeah.
They go, Rebecca, you'll actually be able to think more clearly. So as each day was going on, it almost felt like a layer of everything I was worrying about was just being unpeeled. So all the big stuff, the harm, the suicide, that was slowly being peeled away. And then underneath that as well was, unfortunately, that pedophilia OCD. It's like,
Mhm.
what if? What
Yeah.
if I hurt my son this way? What if, I put nappy rash cream on him. Did I like it? And you're
Yeah.
testing yourself, right? And so as my thoughts became clearer and I was able to articulate that, I'd been holding it in for a few days, but finally I went to one of the psychiatrists, the registrar, and I was like, look, I'm scared to say this out loud, but this is what I've been thinking. And she sat me down and we actually went through the white box. So the Yale Brown Obsessive Compulsive Scale, or YBOCS, however you say it.
Yeah.
And that was confronting as anything, because to have so many ticks, like,
Yeah.
oh, I've thought about this before, I've thought about that, oh, I've done that compulsion before. To see so many ticks on the page, I remember just bursting into tears, because that was very confronting, learning
Yeah.
I have OCD and
I
I
was
have
going to
had
say,
it for a very long time.
yeah, was that the
Yeah.
first time you had been,
hmm
that you knew you kind of had OCD and that had been brought up to you?
I think there'd probably been signs before. I remember even thinking about it in high school.
Yeah.
Um, and ironically, I was obsessing about, do I have OCD? But then I
Yeah.
was like, no, I don't have OCD. It's just anxiety. And that kind of I really suppressed that. And the thought would come up a lot, but I was like, oh, no, I don't. It's just anxiety. Looking back now, it's like, oh, I was obsessing about being
Yeah.
obsessive.
OCD
Like,
about OCD.
yeah, like, come on. It was right there, but I really didn't want to entertain that thought. But seeing it on a piece of paper, the tick, 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 tick was just, yeah, it was very confronting. I'd burst into tears, but also it was quite freeing as well.
Yeah.
A lot of the other mums in the hospital, not necessarily that they were experiencing OCD, but some of them were. And I'd made, really good friends, and we were able to talk about that and, you know, some of the things that we'd been thinking about growing up. And it was like, oh, and I did this and I did that. And it was like,
Yeah.
oh, shit, like, it's not just me. I'm not the only one thinking these things. Oh, my God. And yeah, I think, and I'm very passionate about talking about OCD in the perinatal period because for a lot of us, that's when we get diagnosed, but also that's where it can really become acute, right? If, you know, you've had all these thoughts and, you know, it's then latching onto the thing you love the most, your kids, right? I found that a lot of us in the MBU were going through that. And I guess, you know, once I was discharged from the MBU and, you know, we were doing group therapy and things with, you know, the group of us from the MBU and learning about what the intrusive thoughts are, what OCD is, and just being able to learn that I'm not my thoughts and that I don't have to attach meaning to them. It took a very, very, very long time, but that was very freeing. I think the SSRI, the sertraline really helped me as well. And a lot of trauma therapy that I've been doing in the last 3.5 years since all this happened has actually helped as well, because as I've been processing things and, you know, gaining more confidence in myself, the things that used to drive my OCD, so shame, guilt, fear, that need for control, when those were, I guess, I'm not going to say put to rest because they're definitely still there, but when those were managed, my OCD became managed as well. So yeah, I credit that diagnosis or that, you know, conversation, because yeah, that really, as confronting as it was to think, shit, there's something wrong with me, or, you know, shit, it's so obvious, all these things that I was hiding and or in denial about that I could tick on that box, was like, okay, it also helped, like, to understand myself, to make sense of it, and then to learn how do we go from here, right? Yeah, so that's, I guess, overall my OCD journey. I've just recently welcomed my second baby
I
into the
was going
world.
to ask about that because I know, I think when I started following you, you were pregnant, I think, at the
Maybe,
time.
yeah.
Because I remember seeing you talk a bit about leading up to the birth of obviously your second child. So I suppose we could quickly talk about that as well. So obviously having that first experience and going through all that, having a second baby is going to be, there's going to be a lot to hear there again. So how did you kind of process the second pregnancy and what did you do different?
I mean, firstly, it was terrifying, even just thinking about it. There was that part of me originally, like 3 years ago, that was like, oh, I want another baby. But I think that was driven by that feeling of I want to redo because of what I went through, of the time it took away from my son. There was 6 weeks of his life that he grew up in a mother and baby unit, right? Before we got discharged to go home. That is not how I thought about motherhood. And so there was a lot of shame, and it was like, well, can I get a redo? I want to redo it with what I know now. That took a long time to overcome because I was like, well, that's not a reason to have a baby. Like that's trauma, that's pain, that's grief that needs to be worked through. So finally, when I did want to have a baby for having a baby, not, you know, for a redo or whatever, that was a hard decision and scary, but also I was very supported this time. So I still had my perinatal psychiatrist, who was the head of the MBU, who's still there. I've been seeing her since. She's my regular psychiatrist. I also have my perinatal psychologist who specializes in OCD, in trauma, schema therapy, you know, things that have really helped me. So I had my team. I still had that obstetric social worker who referred me to the MBU, and I credit her for saving my life. You know, I had this incredible team around me, and I guess a big part of coming into pregnancy and even the birth was just learning to let go, I guess, of that need for control. And that was bloody hard.
Yeah,
Like
I can imagine that's almost the ultimate act of letting go.
yeah,
Like, I
yeah.
know, not to derail the conversation, but
No, of
I
course.
mentioned to you when I first contacted you about this that it's interesting because obviously hearing your story and going through it, and I want to have a child at some point,
Mm,
but the fear of that,
mm,
um, going through that process with OCD is
yeah.
obviously very scary. Um,
Mm.
and I know I'm going to do it because that's what I want in my life, and I'm
It's
willing
values
to,
driven, right?
yeah, 100%. And I'm willing to fight. I've dealt with OCD. I'm willing to face it. Um, but also I know exactly like what you just said, the act of having to let go and just
Mm,
surrender to that, it's going to be
yeah,
it's going to be very scary.
yeah,
And I suppose you did it with the second time. So how did that feel for you?
yeah,
What was that process like?
yeah. Scary, definitely.
Hmm.
But again, I'd spent so much time in the 3 years between my births, just having to learn to let go. I
Hmm.
had to learn to do that. You know, it's so many times a thought would come into my head and I would latch and I would start to obsess. And I had to say, I don't have to know the answer.
Hmm.
And that became my, I don't want to say affirmation, but like I
It's a
had to,
way of life almost.
yeah, I had to just say, well, actually, I don't need to know the answer. And I just had to sit with that discomfort.
Hmm.
Well, I don't have to know the answer. I just don't.
Hmm.
And, going into birth again, which was my biggest fear last time, that was scary. But again, I had to learn to let go. We did so
Hmm.
much trauma processing and imagery rescripting and all of those things.
Hmm.
So I opted to have a vaginal birth after C-section, so a VBAC,
Hmm.
which did not go to plan at all. My daughter had other plans. She decided she would turn sideways
Oh
in the
wow.
middle of my labor. And so I had to have a C-section. And so
Hmm.
everything that could go wrong went wrong. My
Hmm.
obstetrician hurt her back that morning. She
Hmm.
could not physically walk, so she couldn't attend.
Hmm.
Just anything that could go wrong that would have absolutely destroyed me last time.
Hmm.
I just said, okay. Like I
Wow.
had a little cry and then I moved on.
Hmm.
And, when the replacement obstetrician came in and said, look, your daughter's gone sideways, it could mean XYZ. We really, want to get you into surgery within the next hour. I
Hmm.
had my little cry. I was like, that's not what I wanted. That's not how I thought it would go down. And I'm scared of the C-section again. I'm scared of what happens if I lose my mind again.
Hmm.
But this is what we're going to do.
Hmm.
So I had my cry. I got up and I walked into surgery. um, and I got to hold my daughter. Still had some panic attacks, of course, but nothing like the last time.
Hmm.
And there are photos of me smiling, holding my daughter
Hmm.
in surgery, which was just everything. It
Hmm.
was, people say, oh, the experience must have been healing for you. And it's like, well, sure, but I didn't want to put that onus on my daughter that she
Hmm.
had to be the one to heal me.
Yeah.
But I also want to give myself credit. Like I did a lot of work. I healed me.
100%.
I did that.
How
You know,
incredible to see the work from your first birth to your second, just in those few
yeah.
years.
Mm,
The bravery, it's amazing, and you should be so proud of yourself.
thank you. And
You,
I
you
guess,
really
yeah,
should.
I can't not acknowledge the fact that I am privileged enough to be able to do that,
Mhm.
to afford therapy and psychiatry and to have that incredible team that I did
Mhm.
around me.
Yeah.
I can't dismiss that
Mhm.
because I know not everyone is so fortunate, but I wish truly that everyone had that kind of team around them
Yeah.
because I
100%.
had to let go and just know that, okay, if it happens again, I have a safety net. I've got a
Yeah.
team that I can fall into. If something bad happens, I have to trust their expertise. I can't
Mhm.
control it. And again, it wasn't perfect. It's not like I completely let go and, oh yeah, whatever. Like, well,
Yeah.
whatever, throw your challenges at me.
Mhm.
But it was just having to put my trust in them and put my trust in myself that maybe I will go through this again. Maybe I'll have a mental breakdown. Maybe I'll be distressed, but I will come out of it eventually. And I had to have some sort of trust and to let go.
And that is such a hard, I think having trust is such a hard thing to have with OCD because everything, there's just doubt everywhere. It's so hard to have trust in anything. But
you don't trust yourself, you don't trust your mind, and you especially don't trust anybody else because you're trying to gain that control. The only thing you can trust is that control you're trying to have, right?
Yeah.
So that wasn't easy, but I did it.
Yeah.
And again, it's not like it was all perfect.
Well,
I spent months.
Is,
No, I spent months thinking something's going to happen to my daughter. This has been too good of an experience. There's going to be something bad happening. So I had to really contend with those thoughts of...
It was kind of showing up in a different way.
Not in a very different way.
The time before, but it was still there and it was still trying to wiggle its way in.
Definitely, it was still, I love my kids so much. What if something happens to them and they get taken away and I lose them? It was things like that. Or this experience has been positive. Shit, something bad's going to happen. It's that superstitious, that magical thinking, that bullshit, right? For lack of a better word, it's that bullshit.
No, it's the perfect word.
But, I did it, and I'm very, very grateful again to the people and the support and the services that I have been able to access, because it's been life-changing, life-saving. And it's funny that we're having this conversation today because yesterday my perinatal psychologist and I have been redoing my wire box. And it's just, again, very confronting, and I felt very crazy, for lack of a better word. It's like, fuck, what's wrong with me? Because again, you're ticking all the boxes, and it just... I've spent the whole day being like, do I even have OCD? What if something else is wrong with me?
I think we mentioned that this morning, didn't we?
We did. It was like, I've just been doubting this. It's like, what if it's this? What if it's that? And it's like, just... So it's still there. Like, I think, and as my psychologist has said to me, she goes, this is who you are. It will always be there, but that doesn't mean it's clinical. So right now, her belief, we still haven't finished going through the white box because it has just been so confronting that I am just, it took over an hour yesterday and we still didn't finish that questionnaire. But as she said to me, she goes, I don't think you're clinical. I think you're subclinical right now, and there will be peaks and troughs in your life. But, the fact that you can pick up on it, it might take a little bit, but I can at least say, okay, hang on, that's my OCD. Let me go deal with it. Let me talk about it. Let me just sit with that discomfort, whatever it is. I have that awareness now, which I never had before. Before it was, let's avoid it. Let's suppress it. Let's, perform compulsions, try to get rid of it, right?
Ultimately, that just makes it stronger and stronger.
It does.
So I think if we do have that bit of knowledge, like you say, it can still suck us in a bit, but at least we have that foundation. To be like, okay, this could be OCD, so I'm going to treat it this way. And it doesn't quite have the power.
No, exactly.
Maybe originally had.
Exactly. And at least I know now, and I can say to myself, okay, I'm thinking it, but that's not me. And learning about, what ego dystonic means and things like that. I learned that in the MBU, right? That always stuck out to me. And it really helped me to be able to say, well, I'm, doing this or I'm thinking this because I love my son. For so long it was, oh my God, I'm thinking this, I mustn't love my son deserves better than me. But to be able to reframe that as, okay, this really shitty thought and this behavior that I'm doing comes back to me loving my son, loving my children, that I think took the distress away a little bit, as much as it could. being able to say, I'm not these thoughts. They're actually just thoughts. I am separate from them. That acceptance and commitment therapy has just been phenomenal as well.
Yes,
for me anyway.
I've never done that, and I'm really interested to hear more about that and learn about that, because I've seen quite a few people in the OCD community talk about ACT therapy,
ACT therapy, yeah.
And I've heard them say how much it's helped them.
And I think, because I think, I'm sure, as we know, a big part of OCD is wanting to get rid of it.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I want to suppress it. I want to do these compulsions and then it will go away. Having that acceptance, it's like, okay, that thought's just there. Okay, you can just sit there. Like, I know you're just a thought. I know you're not who I am. Like, it just, I don't know. For me, it really resonated. And I've done exposure therapy and graded exposure in the context of my anxiety as a kid. I haven't done ERP. I know that that's a big thing that people talk about.
Yeah.
But I suppose for me, ACT, doing schema therapy to work on my traumas, which then, like I said, helped the feelings, the guilt, shame, fear, things like that helped stopped fueling my OCD. So yeah, I haven't done ERP, but I do credit, like, the trauma work I've done, I credit ACT.
It's really
that psychoeducation.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear that different things have worked for different people, because
absolutely,
so much like ERP, like that's what you have to do. So it's so interesting to hear that you actually haven't done that, but you've still made so much progress. And I suppose not doing your second birth, but having your second birth, that's a huge exposure. That's like
huge.
throwing yourself into the ultimate exposure ERP that you could possibly do. So in a way, you kind of done it, just not sat down with you still faced your fears and cut compulsion. So you're still kind of doing it. And what I wanted to ask as well, at what point in your journey did you decide to move into like advocacy work and setting up your page and starting your podcast? And what was it that really, made that decision for you?
I was 3 months postpartum with my son, and I felt, I guess it would be postpartum depression at that point, but I just felt this overwhelming sense of grief. Because it was like, what the just happened? What did I go through? The PTSD symptoms had died down by then, like all the flashbacks, all the hypervigilance, the insomnia. I was still on antipsychotics to go to sleep at night, the SSRI, which I'm still on now, thank goodness. But yeah, it was just this overwhelming, like, what has just happened? And I grieved that. I grieved the fact I wasn't breastfeeding. Like, I was always, I like to say rational. Like, I like to live in the grey spaces where I'm like, look, I know breastfeeding isn't the be all and end all. If I have to formula feed, so be it. But emotionally, I was grieving the fact that it felt like my mental health took it away from me. It felt like my mental health got in the way of my pregnancy. It got in the way of my birth. It got in the way of my postpartum. It got in the way of my parenting. And that's a really awful thing to sit with. And I remember just sobbing for weeks on end, because my friend around that time had her baby, right? We'd been pregnant at similar times, and she had the vaginal birth and, the beautiful newborn bubble. And obviously that's not to say it wasn't hard for her. I don't ever want to take away from mothers who go through this, because it is hard, but mental illness makes things a bit harder. And I grieved that I didn't get what she got, and that it was my mental health that took that away. And I think a big part of, coming out of that grief was trying to make sense of everything that happened, trying to put it into words, and just having this overwhelming feeling of, no one told me. Right? I like to think I've always been an advocate for mental health. I've had anxiety, I've gone to therapy, put my hand up for that. But birth and postpartum really pulled the rug from under me because, I didn't know that it could be so bad that I could go to a psychiatric hospital. I didn't know that mother and baby units existed. I'd never been on medication before. There were all these, I guess, layers of mental health that I carried shame around and I carried stigma around. And it wasn't until I started talking about it during this time period that there were people in my life who put their hand up. Oh, my sister went to that same MVU, or my auntie was there, or I was there, and it's like, why the fuck were we not talking about this?
Yeah.
Why am I sitting here feeling so alone and having this experience, thinking that I'm broken, there's something wrong with me, no one I know has gone through this, no one I know will love me because I'm going through this. But then when you start talking about it and you realize how many people have gone through it, I just had this nagging feeling that I need to do something, I need to talk about it. And so on one hand, it was for myself. It was to articulate what I'd been through. It was to put it into stories so that I could let it go. When you write it, when you say it out loud, it's taken a long time, obviously, but the more I talked about it, the more I shared it, the less it hurt me. And then there was the other part of it where it was like, I don't want any other mother to feel like they are broken or that they are the worst parent in the world. If they go through something like this, I want them to know it's not their fault. You can have, like in my experience, all the knowledge in the world that you think about and be mentally preparing for postpartum and, I've got a perinatal psychologist. Yay, me. Look, I'm being proactive. You can do all of that. And mental health doesn't discriminate, right? No. It just doesn't. And I wanted to talk about that. I wanted to provide a space for people to talk about their lived experiences. I wanted to educate people or at least inform them. And so that's when around 6 months postpartum, I couldn't stop thinking about creating this space. And so I created my Instagram, but I was very silent. I didn't post anything for 3 months because I'm not going to blame OCD for this, but I wanted to get it right? Yeah. Like I had to plan all my posts and everything. And I finally started sharing 3 months after that. So around 9 months postpartum. And I started sharing, snippets of my story or facts that I'd found and things. And it really took off from there. And the ultimate goal was to create the podcast before the social media space. The space was on social media was to complement the podcast. But I had this real blocker that I wanted to tell my story and let it go so that it wasn't hanging over me, but I was still so scared too. So I'd had this Instagram page up and running and, gaining traction and momentum and all these beautiful people reaching out to me. And it wasn't until, I was about a year and 3 months postpartum or something. So 6 months after I started posting on Instagram that I released my episodes and that the podcast kicked off. And again, like I said, there was a part of it that was for me, but there was a part of it because I wanted to help others. That is a big part of also my recovery as well is, I guess, making peace and owning my story. Because I realize I can sit here and pretend it never happened and go back to my job and, close the book and just pretend like none of that happened and none of that changed me. But it didn't feel like that was honoring what I had gone through, what I'd learned. Being able to own my story and hope that something good can come out of it has been very helpful for me. It's very surreal. You get people messaging saying like, someone recommended an MBU to me and I said yes because I'd heard your story and I heard how, helpful it was to you. And it's humbling because it's like, I'm glad that there are mothers out there who can get that help without that extra barrier of shame or stigma, that they know about it enough to, take that step. Or someone will message and say, I was really hesitant about taking medication. I felt so much shame, or I was, sitting on these thoughts. I didn't know that I thought I was the only one that was having them. I'm glad I'm not the only one. I listened to this episode and I'm actually going to see the doctor today. Like things like that. And it
Yeah.
just, yeah, it like gives me goosebumps because it's like, that's the goal. Like
Yeah.
that's the ultimate goal. And it's, yeah, very surreal now that I have guests coming on the podcast sharing their stories and they say, oh, well, I listened to your podcast. And I was like, no, we're here to talk about what helped you. Like, was it the GP? Was it the psychiatrist? Was it the psychologist? They're like, no, your podcast. And it's like, oh my gosh, like that. I want to pinch myself because, I'm really grateful that I have created this space, but also that community. Like people, I just, I guess social media gets a lot of slack and I probably give it a lot of slack too. Like there's a lot we can improve about it, but I also think it's very beautiful for the communities that it can create, just like how we've met and connected. And, we're on opposite sides of the world, but there are parts of our story that are similar. And it's like, well, I'm not the only one. And I just think, thank God for social media.
Right, it's true. And I can very much relate to a lot of what you've just said. I get a lot of messages and things as well. And when you get them, it's almost like it almost makes all that pain worthwhile because you're like, there was a reason. And I know maybe that's me putting meaning onto it, but it's like, but
I know what you mean.
Yeah, but it's still like, okay, even if all that pain that I've experienced, if that can help one person, then it's like, okay, that might make it worthwhile.
And it's like I'm always like so torn when I get those messages because I was like, I don't want anyone to ever have to go through what we go through, right? Like I don't wish that they could relate to it, but I'm glad you don't feel alone.
Yeah,
like it's such that catch-22. But yeah, it feels purposeful. It feels, I guess turning your pain into purpose is,
And I think it's almost, I think this last year for me of having my page, it's really helped me heal a bit as well. Like I feel like my recovery has come on further. And right at the beginning, I didn't feel like that. I think it's because I was getting, well, I suppose it's good actually. I was going to say I would get quite triggered by it and, having to speak about it. But I suppose ultimately that does actually help.
It's exposure.
It's exposure, yeah. But yeah, I do think having the page and speaking out can be very healing, and I think that's kind of what you have said as well.
Yeah.
Oh, well, is there anything else you would like to share today?
No, I think that's my story, and I guess I'm very grateful to have met you and connected with you. And thank you for giving me the chance to talk about this.
No, it's so important. And your story is really, really inspiring. You should be truly so proud of yourself.
Thank you. Maybe one thing I will say is that I know you are scared about, going into parenthood, but also give yourself credit because you know that you have OCD. You've done work on OCD, and I know that you will have an amazing team around you when you go through that. And it won't be perfect like that. We can say that, but I hope that, I hope that the journey you've gone on, the things you've learned, just it'll be more worth it than not worth it. You know what I mean? I'm trying to word this properly. I don't know what I'm trying to say.
I know what you're trying to say, and that means so much. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. So tell the listeners where they can find you before we wrap up.
Sure. You can find me on Instagram, Perinatal Stories Australia, and then you can find me on any podcast platform, Spotify, Apple, all of that, just where we share stories from mums in Australia about their lived experiences with mental health in pregnancy or postpartum. So that could be, from bipolar to psychosis to OCD to depression, anxiety, whatever that looks like, and also what helped them. So, was it a psychologist or was it this group therapy program that's run nationally or, you know, whatever it is, and trying to talk about the options that are available so people are aware, so that there's more, I guess, social literacy when it comes to mental health, and so that people aren't taken by surprise, or that they know, hang on, I didn't try that option. Maybe I'll give that a go. That sounds really good. Or it's just, I've kept it restricted to Australia because the mental health system here is just hard enough to navigate without trying to,
incorporate the whole
expand it.
world.
But I am constantly inspired by the work that other people are doing, and the more people out there in this space talking about mental health, the better. So good on you for starting this.
Oh, thank you. Well, and you, of course. Well, thank you.